Hello everybody. So my name is Niels Corfield. My work is as an independent farming advisor and trainer. I deliver farm walks and consultancies right across the country. And a big part of that is also to do on-farm monitoring. And that's very much where this soil talk comes from. It's called the Weatherproof Farm Towards the Profitable Subsidy-Free Operation. So just for my benefit, what kind of farming types have we got in the room? Any beef and sheep? Yeah, any sheep only? Any dairy? Yeah, any mixed? Yeah, great, good. And what kind of soil types have we got? Any sort of heavy land out there? Bad land? I'm sure that the land likes that term. So bad land, any advances on bad? Heavy, light, medium, loams? Who's got some medium loams? Yeah, sandy, some light land? Yep, any sort of heavy, proper clay, blue clay and that kind of thing? Great, so the whole lot basically. So just a few kind of framing questions, I asked to sort of set the scene if you like. So put your hands up if you're worried about farm incomes. You could more like to keep your hands down if you're not. Anyway, anyone's land lying wet over winter? Yeah, anyone housing? What are we looking at, sort of 6 months? Yeah, any advances on 6? Yeah, good. Yeah, there we go. Anybody see their growth rates dipping off in June of 23, potentially? Yeah, a few of you, yep. Or potentially burnt off, 22 or 18, for example. Yeah, maybe on the light land. Or otherwise, anybody have their best year in 22, potentially? Yep. It's almost a bit like a bidding. Yeah. So essentially, the kind of, if yes to any of those questions, then hopefully this talk is for you. So as I said before, I sort of monitor farms. It's one of the things I do, and I've now monitored over 200 farms right across the UK, which does include some NI farms. Actually, I should add that to the list. And I can now say that I'm firmly convinced, based on that work, that poor soil health and poor pasture health is bringing systemic weaknesses to all grazing operations, upland, lowland, beef and sheep, dairy, across the board. And that's hitting the bottom line. Yep, it's hitting the bottom line by shortening grazing seasons, therefore extending housing periods. It's shortening growing seasons and potentially leading to burning off, which means a lower production. And that will act as a drag on stocking rates, or otherwise increase the cost from inputs and supplements to maintain a particular stocking rate, perhaps more in the dairy situation. So this is kind of some examples, going out and doing some monitoring, in this case, winter of 2019-2020. Hopefully you might remember that, but this is the Shropshire Hills 2019. This is the east coast of Scotland, so lots of standing water across the country. So, back in the day, we would call that the winter from hell, although, the last one's just giving it a run for its money. So here's some monitoring from last year, or this winter just gone, basically. So this is a dairy farm from the northwest of England. And another example here. So lots of standing water around, basically squelchy soil. So again, the standard conclusion based on these types of observations is that our soils are saturated, right? Lots of standing water, therefore soils are saturated. Well, this is where we can get our spades out and literally dig a little deeper, yeah, and see what we can see, essentially. So here's our Shropshire example again. And what we can see at the surface of the soil, it's got that shiny quality at the very surface, basically. But if we then look at the bulk soil, into the ground itself, it's got that sort of matte appearance to it. If we compare that to the surface, shiny versus matte, essentially we're seeing a soil that is essentially dry. Yeah, similar story here. Again, this is east coast of Scotland, overlooking the Cromarty Firth. Your man has handled his soil between thumb and forefinger. Hands are clean, soil is dry. Yeah. This example from just, out of the in-by ground, perhaps just into the allotment, you might say. This is in Lancashire. Again, we'll see that this soil, once we've got it out of the ground, it has that sort of matte appearance to it, basically. So again, to all intents and purposes, a dry soil. This example, a lowland example from the Wirral in this case, we're digging under that puddle in the bottom right. You can see, sort of straight up in front of you, that the soil, on the face is very shiny. That's where the spade went in, but the actual bulk soil itself has that matte appearance. And the final example, again, sort of heavy land in this case, proper clay in this case, lots of standing water, and again, that matte appearance. So again, what we're saying here is that we're seeing that dryness. And the final examples, you're looking at 23, 24 again, this case heavy arable land in Herefordshire. And when we look at the soil itself, again at the surface, it's got that shininess, but when we look in the bulk soil, yeah, it's got that matte appearance. And when we look at our dairy farms again, the standing water at the surface, but when we got the soil out of the ground, again, it's got that matte appearance to it. And when we look in the hole where we dug out of, again, there's no water there, basically. Yep. So the soil is dry, yep, and there's no water in the hole, and we've got standing water and squelchy soil at the surface. Yep. And the final example here, again, from one of these other locations, lots of squelchy soil at the surface, lots of standing water, but then when we actually get into the soil itself, when we dig out and we look in the base of the hole, again, no water oozing in from the sides or bubbling up from underneath, yeah. But what we will see is a little bit of water running, has run down the side where the spade went in, for example, yeah. Slightly heavier land in this case, basically. But again, the sort of take-home message here is that the soils are wet on top but dry underneath, yep. So the standard conclusion would be, in this case, that it's got to be the soil type, yeah? Not me, Gov. So again, this is where we can get our monitoring sort of tools out, basically, to understand the causes of the issues that we're dealing with day to day, yeah? And we use a high-tech piece of equipment to do that. It's called an infiltrometer. It's got the word ometer in it, therefore it must be high-tech. But it is just a steel tube. You drive it into the ground, pour in an inch of water, time how long it takes for that to filter through, yeah? So here's the kind of examples that we've collected. So this is a Dorset dairy farm, height of the drought in 21. In the field, we could infiltrate a full inch of water in 5 minutes, 300 seconds. Over the fence, full inch in 30 seconds. This example from the Yorkshire Dales, permanent pasture. In the field, we could infiltrate about 5 mils in 2 hours. Over the wall, a full inch of water in under a minute. From this winter in Hereford, in the field, test abandoned at 60 minutes. Over the fence, a full inch of water in 6 seconds. Yeah. This example from proper sort of light land, upland light land in the peaks, for example, sort of fairly long-term silage ground. Again, in the field, test abandoned at 40 minutes. Next to the stone wall, little strip of ground next to the stone wall, full inch of water in 12 seconds. Yeah. And when we have allowed these to really play out over long periods, we get things like this. So back to our rural example, half an inch in 6.5 hours. Yeah, in the field. Up against the fence, on the inside of the sheep netting fence, full inch in 8 minutes, essentially 100 times quicker. And again, sort of another example here, heavy land, long-term permanent pasture, in the field, half an inch to 6.5 hours, up against the hedge, an inch in 2 minutes. And again, in the middle of winter, yep. A couple more examples. This is the Shropshire Hills, so sort of more stony land here, basically. In field, test abandoned at 30 minutes. In the middle of a rotted out trailer base, in the centre of the field, we are able to infiltrate a full inch of water in 16 seconds. Again, in the middle of winter. Yep. And that's what it looks like. And again, onto our sort of heavy land again. So proper clay, in this case, from the Sussex Weald. So lots of standing water in the field. But then when we go to the margin, basically, we're able to infiltrate on heavy clay soil in the middle of winter a full inch of water in just a few seconds. So in all of these cases, they are the same soil type. Between left and right, they are the same soil type. Yeah, and we're visually evidencing by the fact that the soils are matte, basically, that the soils are not saturated. Yeah, and just to sort of reiterate that point, another dairy farm, again from the northwest, standing water and poaching at the surface, dry bulk soil, and no water in the hole. And yet when we go to the headland, for example, or the margin, or the verge, I would say, middle of winter, March of this year, we're able to infiltrate a full inch of water in just a few seconds. Again, it's not the soil type. And this really is the final example. So this is low-lying, heavy land, arable land, drained arable land in South Yorkshire, lots of standing water, muddy boots, sticky soil, basically, on your boots. And when we dug under that massive pool of water, again, the soil was dry. But then when you compare it to the neighbouring field, which has been under different management, no standing water, no muddy boots. And what's interesting as well is the ditches are not overtopped. Yeah, so that water hasn't found its way into the ditches. So take home message here, same soil, same rain, different management. Yep. So it's management that's the cause of these issues, not the soil type or the climate. Yep. So we'll look at an example now to illustrate this point. This is a rainfall simulator. We've just equally applied about 2 inches of water, or probably a bit more, equally to all 3 of the trays, and there's 3 different grazing management practices here. None of them are necessarily offered as a prescription, but this is just to illustrate the difference in the results. So with our continuous grazing or set stocking situation, the majority of the water has run off. Therefore, just a little bit has infiltrated. That will translate to standing water in the winter, therefore longer housing. Yep. If we move to our rotational grazing example, we can now see that what was running off is now infiltrating, and vice versa. Yeah. So we've created free draining soils. Yep. Haven't changed the soil type, but we've changed the structure, and that translates to shorter housing periods. Yep. What's interesting then is when we look at the other example on the end, sort of pasture with longer recovery periods, again, not a prescription basically, but to illustrate the differences in the results, we can see cleaner and clearer water, so better water quality, a similar amount of runoff basically. But then when we look at the 2 trays together, you can see that the tub in the back isn't quite full. Yeah. So same amount of water has run off, same amount of water is applied to the surface. Less water is in the infiltration rate tub, that's the one at the back. Where must that water now be? Still in the soil. Yeah? So we've created soils that not only free draining, they're also moisture retentive. Yeah? So what's the significance of that when it comes to production? Yeah? Well, we can look at some grass production data from 2018. Yeah, this is AHDB Forage for Knowledge, mostly dairy farms basically, but aggregated from the whole of the UK. We can see that massive hole in the feed budget. Yeah? So essentially, low soil moisture has led to lost yield. Yeah? And equally, in 2020, we see that same situation again. But how come we're seeing that, given that the fact that, as was, 2019, 2020 was the winter from hell, yeah? If all our soils are saturated, they're full of water, yeah? How can we get to this point here and suddenly our production drops off a cliff? Well, essentially, all our water ran off, and it took our production with it. Yep. Conversely, what would happen if our water infiltrated like this? What would happen at this point here if we were able to, again, infiltrate a full inch of water on heavy clay soils in just a few seconds? Yeah? To my mind, we're going to be ironing out those dips. Personally, I think we're going to be breaking records, actually. Yeah? Because essentially, heat and sun drive growth better than anything out of a bag. Yeah? So long as water is not a limiting factor. Yeah? This is why the northwest of England, for example, had their best year in 22, because they had the elevated temperatures and the more sunny days, yeah, and those little rain events every sort of 4 weeks or so, just when it were getting dicey. That got the 3rd cut in early, 4th cut in, for example, and they're all happy days, basically. So essentially, the take-home message here is all these things, heat, sun, and rain, are all things that people aren't bagging up and selling back to us at elevated input prices. Yeah. However, if you're going from like the Battle of the Somme to the Sahara in just a few weeks, you've got an infiltration issue. Yeah. If you're poached in March and parched in May, you've got an infiltration issue. If you're burning off, 9 times out of 10, you've got an infiltration issue. And if your growth is going up and down like a yo-yo, this is 2023, from mid-May of 100 kilos a day down to 40 kilos a day within 1 month, yep. In the middle of the season, you've got an infiltration issue, or potentially on very, very light soils, a retention issue. But in general, for everybody else, basically, if you've got poor infiltration, you will have wet ground in winter and dry ground in summer. Yeah, so it's the worst of both worlds. Yeah, and that's when that opportunity turns into a threat. And we're constantly dealing with excesses in the winter, housing, poaching, pugging, restoration, for example, and deficiencies in the summer. Yeah, less of an issue for you, potentially in the west as being a high rainfall environment, but essentially it will all translate to lost production and increased costs of production. So what's the cause here, fundamentally? It's poor soil health, yep, or a lack of crumb structure in your soils. So put your hands up here if you eat biscuits. Who eats biscuits? I think a few are in denial, just suggesting that. Well, essentially, what a biscuit's made up of, basically, they're made up of sugar and flour. Yeah, each of your individual sugar grain relative to each other, its partners, basically, is the same size and shape. And similar with the flour. Everybody happy with that? Yep. If we allow them to self-organize, they will produce a packed structure. You put them into the mixing bowl, it will fill that space almost completely. Yep. However, if we add the butter in, and sort of knead that in, basically, we totally change the consistency of that material. Yeah, and most particularly, we change the ranges of sizes. We go from the one in the bottom right there, for example, which might be sort of 3/4 of an inch wide, for example, and the tiddlers are like a couple of mil across. That's like a bowling ball next to a golf ball. Just by adding a small amount of additional material, we've totally changed the consistency of that structure. Yep. And the same is true in the soil. Yeah, so in this case, sand is analogous to sugar, and clay to flour, powder, yeah. And again, same size and shape. So if we allow them to self-organize, they will produce a packed, blocky structure. Yep. And in this case, equally, if we add a binding agent into our soils, now we create a soil that is open. Yeah. We can now see spaces in the soil, channels, caverns, alcoves, that connected porosity, which is what Nikki was mentioning before. Yeah. So essentially what we're seeing here is that aggregate structure created through the production of binding agents creates an open structure that is free draining. Yeah? The open space allows water to move through. Yep. So it means you can get out on your soil earlier, you can stay out on it later. Less poaching, less negative issues. And when you handle the soil, it handles differently.
That's a lot looser, isn't it?
So there's only one thing you take away from this talk today. I want it to be this, basically, that healthy soil, aggregated soils are loose. And you feel that when you spade it and you feel it underfoot, yeah? And you can also feel it just by touching it, yeah? You get it out of the ground and apply what I call the dab test. Imagine you're touching something really hot, yeah? You just basically touch the soil ever so gently, and if it gives, it's loose. It's friable, yeah? And equally, that's what these infiltration rates are telling us. They're telling us about below ground structures, yeah? So the structure we're seeing on the right, fine particle structure, basically, that's what gives us that free draining ability, basically. So your first objective today, then, is to build aggregate structure, yeah? Another way to think about aggregate structure, though, is like it's a bit like the pit props in a deep shaft mine. Yeah, that's what gives function to the mine. What's the structure like without the pit props? It just all collapses back into this dense, solid mineral mass. Yeah? The same is true with aggregation. So no aggregation in the soil means no pit props. Yeah? No pit props means nothing holding it open, and it's settling back into that packed structure. What's an old money term to describe packed structures in soil? Compaction. Yep, pure and simple. Yeah. So take-home message here is your soils are either one or the other. They're either aggregated or they're compacted, unless you're blessed with proper grade 1 self-aggregating soils, basically. But for everybody else in the real world, basically, without aggregation, your soils are compacted. Yep. And again, that's what this above-ground observation is telling us. Where we're seeing that standing water, that's correlating with that blocky structure. Yeah, blocky, packed structure, as compared to the fine structure on the right, for example. Yep. And again, we can look at another example. So this is from a dairy farm in Pembrokeshire. Yeah, and again, you apply sort of gentle pressure, yeah, and you can see that it gives on the right-hand side. So we call that spongy, loose. Yeah, it gives. Whereas on the left-hand side, yeah, you can see that blocky structure, and when you get hold of it at one point, you see the whole thing rocks up and down. Essentially, that means it's all connected, one contiguous mass. That's what compaction means. It's just all attached. Everything's attached to everything else, basically. Another example, we had to look back at those. So on the left-hand side, packed structure. On the right-hand side, a loose structure.
That's a lot looser, isn't it?
Yeah. This example from Lancashire, for example, again, packed, compacted on the left, aggregated, loose on the right. Packed, blocky, compacted on the left, aggregated, loose, friable, open on the right. Yeah, and you can feel this when you get the spade out. Yeah, how easy it is to put the spade in. So this was very early in my journey, for example. In this case, the landlords wanted me to look at his soil, and his garden basically opened out directly onto one of their tenanted arable fields. Yeah, I sort of put my spade in the ground on the right-hand side with the lawn, sort of not much to report. Took a few paces into the field, so kind of odd situation, no fence, no hedge, just edged lawn and then arable field. Yeah, I guess you can kind of do that if you're the landlord. But anyway, as soon as I walked into that field, couldn't get the spade in, literally. Yeah, obviously you're taking a few more paces into the field, the soil, was able to be extracted basically. But essentially, that's telling you what you're going to get when you get it out of the ground. Yeah, so again, packed, compacted on the left, blocky, solid, compared to loose, friable on the right. And don't think of this as being limited to medium or heavy soils. Light soils compact. This example, again, is from the northwest. Yeah, so a light dairy soil, for example. And again, we can see that blocky structure. And in their words, never more than 3 weeks from a drought, even in the northwest of England. Yep, properly west of the Pennines. But again, we're seeing that blocky, compacted structure on the left. We're seeing no water in the spade hole. We're seeing a dry bulk soil. And again, this is March of 24, early March of this winter. So they must have had like at least a metre of rain. Yeah, and we're still seeing that standing water. Again, if we look again at this example from the peaks, again, proper light, sandy soil, you can see that. But again, I apply pressure. Again, you see that smooth surface, but the surface. But then we come and look at the control. Again, it's just loose, friable. It gives when you apply pressure to it, basically. Yeah. And then when we do our infiltrations, that's what it looks like on the right. Yeah, just no infiltration at all. Yep. Compared to the control, full inch of water in just a few seconds. Yep. Essentially instant infiltration. So effectively, what are our compaction indicators? What's telling us that we've got compaction in our soils? Well, first and foremost, is if we've got poaching. Yep. You can see the surface of this soil, at the very top of that, see that smooth surface? That's poaching. Yep. Poaching is telling us that our soils lack sponge structure. Yeah. So when that compressive force is applied by a hoof, for example, it goes down and it doesn't come back up. Yeah. And equally, rutting or messy harvest are also telling us that our soils lack sponge structure. Yeah, if you took a kitchen sponge and you put it in the car park, you could park a truck on it for a week. Yeah? As soon as you back the truck off, bounces back to where it was. Equally, muddy boots are a compaction indicator. Yep. But when we're talking about sort of, saturation and absorption, for example, yeah, do we ever use those terms when we're talking about solids? Do you ever talk about solids being able to absorb water? Yeah? No, only like loose, open, porous, sponge-like structures can actually absorb water, yeah? Because they need that open space to pass the water. So if your soils have a dense, blocky, solid structure, they behave like a solid. They are a solid, yeah? And solids interact with water by displacing it, not absorbing it, displacing it. That's why it sits at the surface, yeah? So again, this is where your squelchy soil comes in. So squelchy soil is a compaction indicator. Runoff is a compaction indicator. And although, yes, it is running in the wheelings, that water all came from all the rest of the field and it's found its way into the wheelings. Yep. And equally, again, if you've got standing water, that's going to find its way, as we saw before, it's going to start running off and it will collect in a hollow. Yeah, it will find that low-lying point, basically. So if you've got water collecting in shallow impressions on your land, that is telling you 9 times out of 10 that all the land around it is compacted. Yeah? So the water is gradually being shed off the surface of that soil, at which point it moves downhill until it finds that low point, basically, which is where it collects. Yeah? And equally, so is erosion. Yeah? Erosion is another compaction indicator. Yeah? Water only moves up the surface of the soil if there's no porosity to let it get in. Yep. And as well as that, we can also look at our indicator plants. So docks and rushes are compaction indicators. Yeah? And this example is from South Wales in December of this year. Yeah? Proper low-lying, proper rushed land. Yeah? And yet when we look at the soil, is there any evidence of water in that soil? No. Yep. So again, it's a compaction indicator, not a waterlogging indicator. So what are the compaction results? Well, first and foremost, housing. Housing is a compaction issue, not a soil type issue. Yep. Compaction also means no air in your soils. Yeah, and as soon as you combine that with water, basically you've got soils that are going sour. Yeah? Sour soils mean greater need to apply lime, so higher liming costs. Yeah? Equally, in an arable context, for example, that's going to narrow our drilling windows, or mean that we miss drilling windows, for example, like this year. Yeah? And that will lead to yield penalties. And on and on. But essentially, you take home message here, your second objective for today is to eliminate compaction. Yep. So why compaction? Well, fundamentally, it is a rooting issue, or a lack thereof. Yep. So why no roots? Yep. So let's look at the arable context initially. So if we've got bare fallows, for example, chemical fallows, they're the worst. Yep. Or late harvests. That's all an issue. Or just having small roots, for example, little roots because of fertilizing practices. That makes plants lazy, for example. Yeah, soil applied N, or just modern crop genetics that are bred in high nutrient environments. So it's essentially just already, or are genetically programmed to be shallow rooting. But in the grazing and mixed context, again, we've got that same point here. That if we're applying soil applied nitrogen, for example, that's making our plants lazy, particularly ryegrass, for example. But otherwise, another reason would be having gappy swards. Yeah? If you've got gaps in the swards, you've got gaps in the turf. Yeah? Gaps between the roots, basically. And this example essentially illustrates that point. This is two halves of the same spit of soil. Yeah? One half has got roots in it, plants in it, one half doesn't. Yeah? The one on the right, there's roots and no poaching. The one on the left, no roots and poaching. So again, gappy swards poach. And when we look at this image, where is the poaching? It's between the plants. Yeah? Again, it's that sponge structure, basically, that we're losing. But as well as that, gappy swards also mean a low sward density. Yeah? And if we look at that up close again, you can see there's gaps between the plants. Yeah? Gaps between the plants basically mean gaps in the leaves. Yeah? That means less leaf area. Less leaf area means less dry matter production. Yep. And particularly for you, where you've got sort of shorter sunshine events, less strong sunshine, for example. Sun is one of those things that is in deficit, for example. So the more leaf area you can put out, the more you can take advantage of those periods when there is sunlight available. But otherwise, rooting depth, shallow roots is the other issue here, or sparse roots. That really is the important thing here. When we're looking at this image, we can see some deep roots going down, but they're few and far between. And it's only in the surface where they're all intermingling and forming a mat, for example, that they're actually doing the job. And you can see that here. In the upper layer, where the roots are intermingling and forming a mat, forming a turf, you've got that loose structure, basically. But below that, again, we're back to that blocky structure. So it's all about dense roots. Yep. But equally, sward composition is a big factor in this same thinking. So if you've got running grasses well represented in your sward, for example, then this is all the roots you've got. Yeah, these are mature plants. That's all the roots they grow. They grow outwards, not down and not up, basically. And when we're looking at this particular example, does that look like a productive grass to you? How much leaf is actually in there relative to the amount of stem? Not much, yeah? And this is why the Kiwis know this well. They call it brown top. Yep. They know it well as a weed grass, basically, or a poverty grass. Yeah, because it all looks green and growing, fine, yes, but don't keep stock. Yep. And you look at this image, where are the stock? On the green bits. Yeah, so they've found the clumping grasses and they're giving them a good going over. And everything else, that sort of pale brown tan colour, that's all the running grass, basically. And this is what it looks like before we've done our assessment, and this is what it looks like afterwards. So I think generous to say that we're probably at 50% cover in terms of productivity. Yep. Yeah, and this is one of the main reasons that particularly reseeds kind of run out of steam. Yep. You've lost your running grass, your clumping grasses being replaced by poor performing, poor palatable grasses, and that leads to low stocking rate. And equally, having mosses in pasture also delivers on this same point. And in this case, mosses haven't even evolved roots. Yep, that's why they grow on rocks and roofs. Yeah, so if you've got mosses in pasture, by definition, you've got a low spore density. No one ever finished an animal on moss. Yeah, and when we look at this example, sort of close up, you can kind of see that essentially all that's there is running grasses, bare patches, and moss, basically. So equally, moss is a compaction indicator. It's a surface dweller. Yeah. So the final example that we look at here is just plant size. Yeah, small plants. Which of these two plants would you rather base your livelihood on? Which of these two plants is going to start growing earliest in the season? Which of these two plants is going to continue to grow mid-season if it does dry up, for example? Yeah? Which of these two correlates with the excellent infiltration? And which of these two is going to hold up stock in the shoulders when it does get wet? Yeah? Well, it's the one on the right, basically. Yeah? So essentially, the take-home message here is that small plants mean small roots. Yeah? This example here are mature plants, not seedlings. Yeah? More associated with sheep pasture, basically, but tiny little things, basically. So we can say simply here that small plants are leading to long housing periods. Yeah, on 100 head of cattle, that's 37 grand. Yep, for 6 months, for 5 months. Small plants are also leading to drought, and small plants are acting as a drag on stocking rates. But what is making these plants small? Yeah. Well, we're all familiar with bonsai trees. Yeah. Is there anything different genetically between them and those sort of standard oaks growing out in the hedges? No. It's how they're managed. That pruning regime causes, like what would otherwise be a 30, 40-foot tree to size down to just a few foot tall, basically. Yep. So our final objective then is to maximize plant size. So let's link that into management, and particularly grazing management here. So put your hands up and keep them up if you cut silage. So keep them up if you cut silage every 7 days. Why not? One word. Which translates to the big Y word, yield. No? I mean, there's just nothing there to cut, in simple terms. And who's doing it every 3 days? Well, if you're set stocking, that's exactly what you're doing. But rather than just doing an even cut across the whole pasture, you're selectively taking the most palatable, most productive plants every 3 days. Is that going to act as a drag on production? Is that going to reduce yield? So essentially, set stocking is the definition of overgrazing, irrelevant of stocking rates, yeah? Because animals are spending too long in paddock, yeah? Which means they have access to the regrowth, and they will preferentially select regrowth over everything else, because essentially everything else is just being rejected, just building up on a plane of rejection. So really, when we use the term overgrazing, we should be using this term here, under-resting. Yeah, the other one's a bit sort of misleading, basically. It means that animals are returning to the plants before they have fully recovered. And in this case, essentially what you're doing is eating roots. Yeah? And this causes the plants to size down. Yep. And conversely, rest allows plants to grow big, to realize their potential, and for roots to grow, and for aggregation to follow. Yep. So we look at this example again. On the left-hand side, set-stocked, overgrazed, under-rested. Yeah, as opposed to the one on the right, which has rest applied to it. So the definition, if you're set stocking, then you're wasting grass. Pure and simple, yeah? And if you're set stocking, you're understocked, probably to the tune of 2x, if not more, yeah? So your mosses, your running grasses, your small plants, and potentially land slips, they're all overgrazing indicators. So we want to eliminate overgrazing. Okay, so I'm going to spend the last sort of 10 minutes or so just looking at the sort of solutions, if you like, which is, just really a sort of an overview, yeah? But top of the list, address management factors, basically, yeah? Because that is the cause of the issues that we're dealing with. Always better to treat causes than symptoms, yeah? So this is some trials work from that Nikki was alluding to earlier, for example, and this is from Rothamsted. And this shows over a 4-year period stocking rates of cell grazing in green versus set stocking on the left. Stocking rates are flat on the cell grazing, And by the time we get to 2021, although I don't think you would need to have waited 4 years to get to that point, we have doubled stocking rates. Doubled stocking rates. Twice the amount of animals on the same amount of land, yeah? With a small hit on daily live weight gain, but still commercial, yeah? And to me, this image is really just says it all. Yeah, cell grazing on the right, clean grazing, left-hand side, set stocking, dirty as you like. And equally, what we also seen, compared to the initial established sward, now the grass has successed to 80% Yorkshire fog, whereas the cell grazed has maintained a significant amount more of the original sown ryegrass. And we're also seeing in this same study 28 days longer at grass. Yep. So essentially the take-home message here is that management is translating to yield. But we're not limited to that. And again, perhaps in the dairy context, there's a little bit less wiggle room, for example. Yep. So this one we can be looking at complementary interventions like mechanical interventions. So we're looking at subsoiling, for example. And this is some trials data from across the pond. And what they showed is the best performing treatment increased infiltration by 10 times, that's on the left-hand side, and increased yield by 80%. Yeah. Another bit of kit that fits, what's it called? Medium soils and heavy soils, particularly in dry periods, is a heavyweight flat roller that air works. And in that situation where you get a good shatter, it behaves like a fast 3-meter subsoiler that you can run at double digits forward speed. So again, the take-home message here is the mechanical is delivering on infiltration, and infiltration is delivering on yield. But again, we're not limited to any one of these interventions alone. We can combine these, and it definitely seems that the combination of these is where we get that sort of lift, if you like. Yep. So in this case, this is trials work comparing subsoiling with and without gypsum, yep, over a 4-year period. And what we can see is where we've combined subsoiling with gypsum, we've improved on the loamy sand, nearly 100% better infiltration, and on the clay loam, sandy clay loam, so by no means a heavy soil, we're also seeing over 130% infiltration over a 4-year period from a single application. Yeah. But as with all of these things, we want to use our own sort of on-farm efficacy testing methods to establish whether a particular intervention or product is indicated in our situation. And this is a jar test showing the interaction of gypsum with soil, mostly with clay. So this is the flocculation process. So the one on the right-hand side has been treated, and this is in real time. So you can see there's a rapid settling process that's taking place here. And that essentially is telling us that flocculation is occurring. It's those clay particles, agglomerating, sticking to the individual clay particles to form a new, larger particle, which then drops out of solution. Yep. And that on the left, and that's the inset, that's the start. So you can all do this. Yep. And again, back to this trials work, we're seeing that not only is this work paying for itself, yep, but it's also giving us a positive net outcome. So essentially, mechanical and a mineral deliver on margin. So a little bit on diversity. Again, looking at things like herbal lay. So this is work from Choggusk. Yeah, so they're comparing more diverse mixes against straight ryegrass. And on zero nitrogen, yep, the more diverse mixture cannot yield less than 11.5 tons. Yeah, the ryegrass, on the other hand, starts at half that. The only way it gets in the game is on 300 units of N. Yep. Some more trials work in this case from Germany. In this case, they're showing over 5 different treatments a strong correlation between yield and diversity that's not flattening out at 60 species. Yeah? Whilst also maintaining energy and protein. So essentially, diversity is delivering on yield and it's delivering on quality. And just a little sort of side note on agroforestry, just to make the sort of suite complete, but it's not a prescription. But essentially, the take-home message here is that the right tree in the right place improves every single metric in a grazing operation. Yep. So the first interaction basically is that trees act like living land drains. And this is from Clive Bright's farm down sort of in the south, for example. Again, you can see on the right-hand side in the open pasture, rushes are dominating. And in the trees, grasses are dominating. Yeah. So the take-home message here, trees kill rushes, trees favour grasses. They are not antagonistic. Yep, great. So we can also look at the Loch-Gould trials work basically, and that essentially illustrates that where trees are present in an agroforestry system, they are extending grazing seasons by 17 weeks, therefore shortening housing seasons by 17 weeks. Yeah, and that's also happening in the middle of winter. Yeah, without the leaves on the trees. These dates are December, January, February. Yeah. We're also seeing where animals have access to shelter, significant improvement in live weight across 5 years. Yep. So a significantly reduced maintenance requirement. Yep. And it's all about the layout. Yep. So the right layout means we can maintain full access for cutting, baling, or even mixed farming. Yeah. And this particular example is about 18 months old. So it doesn't need to be a long-term investment either. But again, the take-home message here is that trees translate to production. So the conclusions then basically is that a good soil or good soil health is aggregated. Yeah, if you want to know whether your soil is healthy or not, it's got that looseness, you can do the touch test, or you can do the infiltration test. Conversely, poor soil health is compacted. Yeah, so essentially, wet-lying land is a soil health issue, a compaction issue, not a soil type issue. Yeah, housing is a soil health issue, a compaction issue. Burning off is a soil health issue. Yeah, and equally, if you've got ryegrass only, you're missing a trick. You really are. And if you're set stocked, you're understocked. Yeah, so the outcomes here is, again, backed up by really quite decent data, and also anecdotally, is we can grow significantly more grass. We can increase our stocking rates significantly. And from that, we can increase farm incomes, yeah? And we can lengthen the grazing season, therefore reducing housing costs, particularly important for you guys, yeah? We can reduce or eliminate nitrogen. No grass crop should need nitrogen, yeah? And therefore, we can reduce the cost of production. And equally, we'll be happy in wet winters next time it rolls around, and we'll be increasing our production in those dry spells. Yeah, because we're moving to production from free resources, all those things that God gave us, the sun, the air, and the water. Yeah, so that's all I wanted to speak about. So we're going to have some questions now, so thanks very much.